Hello and welcome to Classeek 15, our bite-sized podcast with me, Jack Pepper, sitting down with stars and behind-the-scenes figures in the classical music world, hoping to give young and emerging classical musicians some top tips on how to break into and make a living from classical music. Today we welcome the novelist, librettist and classical music writer Jessica Duchen. She was the classical music correspondent for The Independent from 2004 to 2016, and she contributes to BBC Music Magazine, The Sunday Times and the London Evening Standard, to name just a few. As a librettist, she's written numerous texts for choral works and operas, working with the composer Roxana Panufnik. Among their works, Silver Birch, commissioned by Garsington Opera and shortlisted for an International Opera Award back in 2018. Her novel, Immortal, was released in 2020 and is based on the latest research into the identity of Beethoven's mysterious immortal beloved. Well, we started by exploring the world of music journalism, and I began by asking Jessica what a good music journalist needs to be.
Hello, Jack. Thank you for having me on the podcast. And that's an extremely good question. I think that the qualities I would put first, obviously, is that you need to be a good writer and you need to know your music. You need really to have a pretty thorough knowledge of repertoire. And to be willing to be open-minded enough to go and research things that maybe you don't know so well. So basically that means you need an enormously inquiring mind and the ability to communicate your enthusiasm and your passion for music. I was telling somebody just yesterday, actually, that to me, a music critic is somebody who loves music and wants to be at events and wants to be listening to masses of recordings and just has that hunger to have music in their life and to communicate it.
And what is the biggest challenge facing a music critic, a music journalist today? What's the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge is that there are not very many opportunities for work. When I was in my teens and early 20s, there were jobs. You could actually have a proper job as a music journalist. You could be employed by a newspaper on a contract. The number of people I know who operate like that now, I can honestly count on the fingers of one hand. If you're not an editor, if you're not employed by a newspaper on the editorial staff, you are probably not going to get a job as a critic. You're going to be freelance and you're going to be dependent on a shrinking pool of opportunity across the board. So the biggest challenge is that the profession is under threat. That's the bottom line.
So is it a sustainable career? How do you make it a sustainable career? If there's a sort of shrinking pool of employers and you're increasingly having to sort of juggle different projects, how do you make that work for yourself practically?
Well, it's getting increasingly difficult. You have to be very resilient and you have to be very resourceful. So the way I manage this is that I have a portfolio career. I've never been only a music critic. I spent my first 10 professional years as an editor on various different music magazines. I was assistant editor on The Strad to begin with, and then worked in various capacities for various other music magazines. And since I've been freelance, I've never been just a music critic. I've been writing other things. I've written novels, I've written librettos, I've done some oral history projects, and I've tried to make the most of the opportunities that have come along. And of course, then you get the challenge that you don't quite know when to say no. So you can end up kind of buried under an enormous pile of different things, trying to keep track of them all and trying to keep on top of them. So it keeps you on your toes, this whole thing, but you have to be willing to be flexible and resourceful and not expect that the world owes you a living, because they sure as hell don't.
So do you remember the first article that you wrote?
I remember my first article very clearly. I was still a student at university at the time, but it wasn't a student newspaper. It was actually The Strad. I was very, very lucky in that someone who had been a music teacher of mine earlier. In fact, the person who had coached me for the entrance exam for Cambridge, as in those days there were entrance exams, went on to become the editor of the Strad and knew that I was interested in writing because I had always been a writer. I've been writing since I was 6. And then I got interested in writing about music. And he decided to give me an opportunity to go and do an article. And he said, okay, will you go and interview Ida Hendel for me and see how you get on? And of course, Ida Hendel was absolute giant of the violin world. And I was very starstruck. Fortunately, she'd written an autobiography. I think it was an autobiography. Maybe it was just a biography. It's so long ago, I can't remember. We're talking 1986 here. Anyway, I got this book and I did all my research and I jumped on the top of the bus and went off to the West End to meet her. And she was very keen to know how old I was because I was 20, but I probably looked 12. On the other hand, she would not tell me how old she was, not for anything.
And so was your early ambition to be a writer, to be a player? What came first, music or words?
Actually, words came first. I had always wanted to be a writer, and I first started trying to write a novel when I was about 11. I finished a novel when I was 13, and I finished another one when I was 14, and another one when I was 15. It doesn't mean they were any good because they weren't, but I did write them and I did finish them. And then when I was about 15, I was switched on to music quite dramatically because I was having piano lessons and I all practiced and I was doing grade exams and I was doing grade 8. But it wasn't till I heard Christian Zimmermann play at the Royal Festival Hall that I realized a piano could do that. And I thought, blimey, I really would like to take this a bit more seriously. And then the following year, I went to music summer school at Dartington and found myself surrounded by people who loved music for the first time ever. And I just adored it and I wanted to be part of it. And I wanted to really make myself part of that community. And at that point, I really started slogging at the piano and I thought that I wanted to be a pianist. But you need a lot more than determination at the age of 16 to become a pianist. You need to have had that determination basically when you were 7.
So what made you realise then, at that point, when you were thinking, I want to be a classical pianist, and then you had to sort of evaluate yourself and where you were? When did that happen and what led to that change?
That actually happened when I left university. I studied music at university and spent 3 years just struggling to find somewhere where I could practice without people grumbling at me and being horrible about it. I thought that I wanted to go to music college and do a full performance course. Basically, I lasted 3 weeks on that. I had this big sign in the back of my mind going, sort of flashing up one of those American road signs that says, "You are on the wrong road." And I bottled out. I went back to Cambridge and I did a 1-year postgrad degree instead, which is half research and half performance. Unfortunately, they've discontinued it now, but it did suit me very, very well. And at the end of that, I had to come out of this buffer zone and consider whether I wanted to carry on. And I'd done quite well with the piano in the meantime. I'd felt I had more space to develop. But what I had not got to grips with was nerves. And I remember 2 weeks before my final recital for this exam, I was an absolute wreck. And I had to get somebody else to phone up my piano teacher and say I couldn't go for my lesson because I was in too much of a funk over the nerves. And, if you're 23 and you are not performing Rachmaninoff concertos around the world and you have not been signed up by the best agency and record company in the business, you're probably not going to make it. And I reckon that there are people who thrive on nerves. And if you're going to have a performing career, you need to thrive on that stress. And I didn't.
Is there a different kind, or indeed maybe a similar kind of nervous energy, though, when you're interviewing somebody? Say you have a titan of the classical music world and you have an hour of their time. How do you feel in that scenario, Jessica, and how do you control yourself in that space?
I've had a few. I find if it's somebody I admire very much indeed, then I'm really excited about it. And I sometimes have had to sort of gather some courage before walking down the road from the tube station to the appointed hotel, or picking up the phone, or indeed the Zoom call. Zoom is very, very useful for these things. So it can be a big asset. It means, again, you're really well prepared, you're really motivated, and there's massive stuff you actually want to know about. So very often I find I'm just asking people the things I want to know about how they function.
And presumably you have a unique perspective as well, as you mentioned, being a librettist and a novelist as well. Is that a different mindset? If you're writing a book about Beethoven's immortal beloved, say, as a novelist, are you a different writer to when you are writing a music article, say?
Oh, well, stylistically, definitely different. I do remember having a conversation with a colleague about conveying character in interviews, because she was curious to know how I did that. And I've never really thought about it. It's just something that I think probably does come out of conveying character in novels as well, and knowing how to build a picture of somebody, which isn't something I've necessarily been very aware of doing in articles. But I do have a sort of writerly radar. I've got some antennae on my head. And if somebody in an interview produces a sentence that I just feel, gosh, that really says who they are, or that really tells us something about them, my antennae go, whoop, I can use that. And I do find that if you can develop that sort of technique for just nailing a character and putting them across, it really does help.
Yeah, building the picture, building the story. How do you build the novel? If you have an idea for a classical music based novel, how receptive is a publisher, say, to that idea? Do you self publish? How do you make an idea come to life as a novel around classical music?
Well, again, there's a shrinking amount of interest, because the profession is in a terrible state at the moment, post COVID and post all these appalling government and BBC cutbacks. It's really depressing. And it's something I wouldn't advise anybody to do, really. On the other hand, we've now got a situation where there are all these movies coming out. There's been Tar, there's been the Bernstein film Maestro. I was just reading yesterday about a new Russian film called Tchaikovsky's Wife, which is a bit of a terrifying prospect. But there seems to be somehow a kind of resurgence of interest in the movie industry. And I'm hoping this means there's going to be some kind of turnaround coming. I was talking to my 18-year-old goddaughter yesterday, and she said she thought that there's an upsurge of interest in classical music among young people, partly because streaming is so easy and you can just move from genre to genre at the flick of a button, which certainly wasn't the case when I was her age. So maybe all is not lost.
So, what would be your advice to somebody like your goddaughter, if there's an 18-year-old or somebody in their early 20s listening, maybe somebody who, like you, is learning an instrument and thinking, well, actually, how else can I make a career practically out of my love of music? What would be the best thing that they could keep in mind, the best thing they could do practically to explore this area of words and writing linked to music?
I think that there is only one way to be a writer, and it is to write. I think you can't afford that, life is short. You can't afford the time to sit there navel gazing about the marvels of creativity. You've just got to get on with it. I think it was Tchaikovsky who said, inspiration is a muse that does not willingly visit the lazy. So the way he got all his music written was he sat down at his desk at 9 o'clock every morning and he got on with it. I interviewed John Adams recently, and I said, what does your working day look like? And he said, well, I work banker's hours. Writing music is a lot of work. Similarly, writing a lot of words is a lot of work, and you've just got to do it. So don't be afraid. Just plunge in. Be willing to revise. Be willing to be open-minded. Be willing to take advice and to show your work to people. and to read a lot. If you want to write well, you have to read good books. I mean, really good books. Read Dickens, read George Eliot, read George Orwell, read Rose Tremaine, read the great writers, and they will be your best teachers.
Well, it's very appropriate us having this chat, Jessica, because I remember the first articles I wrote, you very kindly published on your JDCMB, on your blog. And so it was you were a great sort of mentor to me as a writer and a music journalist. So it's a great treat to be able to sort of explore this for other young people too. Jessica Duchen, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Jack. Really appreciate it. And it's great to see you going from strength to strength as well.
And thank you for joining us for Classeek 15. All the episodes in the series can be heard on the usual podcast platforms and online at classeek.com. Head to that very website too for the very latest opportunities and video on demand. And for an up to the second radar, why not follow Classeek on social media at Classeek Music, the handle to use. Thanks for joining me, Jack Pepper, and hopefully we will chat again in another Classeek 15 before long. See you soon.